Good afternoon. For those of you who have joined us, I'm Anita Ramasastry, a professor at the University of Washington Law School. This is the fourth in our series focusing on rule of law during a pandemic, looking at how governments and other stakeholders are balancing public health requirements with other issues relating to human rights and the impact of certain laws on different people. Today, we have a slightly different focus than ones we've had in prior weeks. We're now looking at the role of the private sector. As you can imagine, as global business is dealing with new challenges, both of economic shutdowns, but also needing to continue to produce essential goods and services, there are many issues that are coming up around how do you protect workers, how do you deal with essential human rights issues in these global markets and in supply chains and with companies that are operating in many different places. As governments struggle to enforce laws and to deal with different kinds of issues, the question is, what role should the private sector play itself in promoting what we call responsible business conduct and dealing with what we call respect for human rights in their business operations. So I'm really pleased that we have three experts here today, really just to talk about, well, what are the challenges that companies are seeing as they deal with this new environment, right? New challenges, economic recession, trying to deal with issues of compliance, and also trying to deal with a rapidly evolving scenario in multiple places. So I'm really pleased to introduce our three speakers. We have Peter Nestor, who is a human rights manager from Novartis and a graduate of the University of Washington School of Law. So welcome, Peter. We have Marcus Funk, who is a partner and a co-chair of the supply chain compliance practice at Perkins Coie, based in Colorado, but a Seattle firm. Welcome, Marcus. And we have Dunstan Allison Hope, who's a vice president at Business for Social Responsibility, who also deals with these issues in terms of human rights, women's empowerment, inclusive economy, and has a special expertise dealing with companies in the ICT sector as well. So I think, Peter, we're going to lead off with you, really talking about working inside a company, having a human rights hat or portfolio. What are you seeing? And especially since Novartis deals with pharmaceuticals, right? You're continuing to deal with important products and services for the world.
Yeah, very good. Thanks very much, Anita. And hello, everyone. Looking forward to a really good conversation today, and greetings from Switzerland. Yeah, it's been a really interesting couple of months, especially working at a healthcare company and potentially making a product or developing a product that could quite literally save the world, or being in that industry. There are a lot of ethical considerations, some human rights considerations that we've thought about. I, as Anita said, work in the human rights department, relatively new department at Novartis, and one that is committed to implementing the guiding principles on business and human rights. And so, yeah, we've had a lot to think about over the last couple months. Let me go through a couple of areas just to highlight the scope of what we're doing, and then happy to engage on any specific topics as we get into the Q&A. So when something like this happens, or when any kind of a human rights issue comes across our plates, our first question is to ask, what is our scope of responsibility as a company? Who do we need to respect, protect, or make sure that human rights are being adhered to in a lot of different ways that we impact the world? So we can sort of roughly divide it into three different communities. One is our own employees within sort of our own closest sphere. The second is then our suppliers and who we might have business relationships with. And the third is the broader public or other communities that might be impacted either by our operations or by what's happening in the world. So we sort of went through some various steps and ideas on what we could do from a human rights standpoint as a company in each of those spheres. Let me take the last one first, because it's a little bit more complicated and tends to be more ambiguous, which is, what is our role to the communities or to the broader public at a time like this? As I said, luckily working at a healthcare company, our core product is advancing human rights. That's a really good thing, but we're not necessarily in the business of making vaccines. Several companies are, and they are sort of right at the forefront of what's happening now. So when I say we might develop the cure that could save the world, Novartis probably won't, although we are trying to contribute whatever science we can. Right after we sort of realized that COVID-19 was going to sort of get out and get around the world, we took a look at our product portfolio and made available a drug called hydroxychloroquine, 130 million doses of that is now being used in clinical trials as a treatment, not necessarily a vaccine. We're also running some clinical trials on other products and other medications that we have that aren't necessarily used to treat this, but are used to treat similar diseases like pneumonia. This does kind of expose an area that I think we might want to think about more as a company over the long term when it comes to our human rights obligations. A lot of pharmaceutical companies and healthcare companies have moved away from developing vaccines because they're not profitable for the most part. This might be an opportunity for us to rethink whether or not we take on, vaccines again as part of our access to medicine portfolio, or whether or not we make that more of a bigger part of our core product. We've also entered into partnerships with the Gates Foundation, the WHO, the National Institutes of Health, again, helping them and sort of delivering science wherever we can based on products that we have. We also established a $20 million fund, actually $25 million now. The Novartis Foundation kicked in another $5 million. That's going to local communities to help them support healthcare infrastructure, delivery of medicines, and any other sort of COVID-19 specific responses that's required. We've delivered about 10 million of that, and all of this is available on our Novartis.com website if you want to take a look at that, or if you're at an organization who might want to apply. Those applications are being run through local country offices. In terms of coming back to our sort of a little bit closer to our home and what we've done to protect employees, we came out with a couple announcements. One is that we would not do any layoffs or redundancies, as many companies sort of undergo structural change on a very regular basis as part of a routine part of doing business, and we put a halt on that for a period of time before we get a handle on what's happening. So that was good. That was a clear message to our employees that look, at least for the short term, there won't be any job losses. The second thing we did was offer 12 days of paid leave to all caregivers, including parents, which has been a godsend for anybody who has kids at home, and also for anyone who's taking care of someone who comes down with COVID-19 or needs other specific care. So that was great. We've also had very flexible work from home schedules and sort of the option to come back to work, but not a requirement by any means if it's possible to work from home. So that's been good. As an employee, I feel very well taken care of. A lot of other companies have done some good stuff. We took the lead from a number of organizations listed on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. I just read a great piece by the Institute for Human Rights and Business, IHRB. They put out sort of a one-page, one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what a company should do and what companies have been doing in responding to this. So that's a great resource. What we realized was that no one was looking after that third sphere of suppliers and what our obligations there might be. It's a really difficult one outside of the COVID context as well, because employees of suppliers are not employees of Novartis. So it's very difficult to force our suppliers to take on new programs or do things like offer 12 days of paid leave or make sure that PPE is required for everyone or change shifts around. But we felt like we still had an obligation to do something. So our team very quickly developed a guidance note and tried to boil it down to about 4 pages of guidance that we could quickly get out to suppliers. We wanted to make that public so that other companies could take it and disseminate it if they would like. And I certainly encourage, if there's any companies listening here, to continue to do that, or feel free to contact me if you'd like a Word version of it so you can modify it more easily. So we can't impose any new contractual obligations on our suppliers, but we wanted to nudge them a little bit and make sure that they knew that a customer was looking. We do have obviously some leverage over our suppliers, and we felt like at least sending them some guidance that said,
Peter,
hey,
can
look.
I just chime in for a second to say, when you're talking about suppliers, these are people these are factories and manufacturers, right, for some of your products, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So it's going to be manufacturers of pharmaceuticals, of drugs, but also all of our indirect suppliers as well. So construction companies that might be building a factory for us, or maintenance companies that are providing service to those factories, or all of the janitors or chefs or cooks who might be outsourced on our campuses and offices around the world. It comes out to be a pretty significant number. 400,000 or 500,000 people are indirectly connected within one tier of working for Novartis. So it's a pretty big group of people. We, in our guidance, I guess we also wanted to pick up on some of the basic stuff around social distancing, the guidance that's been out on washing hands since day one. All of that is in there, but we did want to try to take a human rights approach and pick up some of the issues that might not be caught or that we hadn't seen out there yet. For example, protection of migrant workers, and now we're starting to see more guidance and more consideration for vulnerable groups such as migrant workers coming out. But they are really vulnerable. In many cases, they are not afforded the same protection legally or entitled to the same benefits legally as citizens of their host countries. They often don't have a place to go or are not permitted to or cannot afford transportation back to where they need to go. So we did want to include in our guidance some initial thinking on how a company could support migrant workers if they needed to do redundancies or go in that direction. We also indicated that we don't anticipate any delayed payments to suppliers, which is good. That's probably the number one thing that we can do. As the pandemic has continued to spread and has increased in seriousness, I don't know if anyone knows how long that can go on, but obviously we will try to, we'll try to continue paying suppliers as best we can. A couple issues on the horizon that we're looking at just going forward, and then I'll hand it back to you, Anita. The first is on clinical trials. So this is the process where drugs are tested. Obviously now what's nice about having the pandemic on the front pages is everyone learns a little bit more about the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare industry, but I'm sure everyone knows what clinical trials are right now because we're all watching which companies are starting them on this. But it's the process of testing a drug out. It requires a lot of time and they're a heavy burden. They're extremely expensive and they have to be conducted correctly. We had about 500 ongoing clinical trials, or we do at any given time. Several of those have now come to a halt or have been stopped or delayed. There are some really big ethical questions we have to think about around reopening some of those trials, determining what drugs might be essential drugs, and what if some of our drugs are not essential drugs, but we want to reopen them anyway? Are we taking the right precautions to do that? Are we putting people at increased risk? Should we be directing our resources elsewhere? If, especially during this time for the next couple of years, maybe supporting on some clinical trials for others. Not sure yet, but that's one that over the last week or so has been front and center for us. And then the second is just kind of reiterating this point on migrant workers. We saw the spike in cases in Singapore. We know that was due primarily to poor practices at migrant worker camps. So this is not necessarily limited to emerging markets like Bangladesh, Pakistan, other areas like that. This can happen in places where migrants are sort of ostracized from society or put at a much more vulnerable position. So that's something we want to take a look at. Also, if we have to start doing our own redundancies over the next couple of years, we want to complete our obligation to do due diligence first and to come up with some kind of a risk tool where we can say, all right, do we know that we are putting people in a greater risk if we have to ask them to leave work? And are there things we can do to help mitigate that and protect it? We might still have to go through with redundancies, who knows, but we want to do it in a way that respects human rights, and especially now for these heightened groups of vulnerable people. So those are a few things we've done and are thinking about. Happy to take the discussion forward in the Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter. And yeah, just to encourage people who are listening, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll turn to question and answer after we've heard from Marcus and Dunstan, so feel free to start putting your questions there. And Peter, you've raised any number of issues. One, which is just that your company is thinking ahead, right? And saying that we're not going to make decisions until we think about the larger impacts of things like not fulfilling our contracts, redundancies, how we treat vulnerable groups. And so it's really interesting to see that you are doing that and your company is willing to take a longer term view as it makes those decisions. Marcus, we're going to turn to you next. And again, you advise a lot of major multinational companies as they deal with business and their supply chains. And I know that you've focused a little bit on the issue of forced labor and trafficking. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing and what your clients are experiencing now.
Yeah, sure thing, and great to be here with you guys. The short answer is that really our work divides up into sort of three buckets. One is on the front end, we help companies develop compliance programs. We sort of help either build or fine tune their compliance infrastructure. In the middle, we do sort of on the spot advising when issues come up, if they have some sort of a hotline call. whistleblower reach out, we will help advise them on sort of how to categorize and triage and respond. And then the third thing that we do are the investigations, right? Where we then go and travel and interview people and look at emails and so forth. And so what we've seen in terms of the, living in this turbulent time is that companies that have large in-house operations, like Peters and like Novartis, they continue to work on their compliance infrastructure. They obviously can keep on running their investigations and they keep on calling. What we've seen a little bit of a contraction in are companies that are sort of on the smaller scale that really rely on outside counsel and that have limited legal budgets. Everyone's got uncertainty. Today's articles talk all about law firms and the uncertainty even in the legal profession in terms of furloughs and salary cuts and so forth. And so understandably, a lot of companies are scaling back a bit what they're doing on the compliance infrastructure part. Obviously, if there are ongoing investigations, those are going. But a lot of them, will say, hey, look, let's just hit pause here, pencils down for now until we figure out our own business course, and then we can re-engage. Now, obviously, the risk is, and the risk of any kind of complacency now is, as we know, the folks that are involved in organized criminal conduct in the context of forced labor. When I say forced labor, I mean trafficked, slave, indentured servitude, child labor, sort of a catch-all term. But the people who are already engaged essentially in forced labor manufacturing overseas are already outside of the law, right? So they're not going to be too concerned about their workers' rights. They're not going to be too concerned about a pandemic and social distancing. And so they are concerned, and Judge Kendall, Virginia Kendall, and I wrote an article on this in Bloomberg a couple weeks ago. The incentive structure is set up that supply chains are constricted. Companies are more desperate than ever to make sure they get what they need to keep their supply chains running, particularly those that don't have a dedicated supply chain that essentially use multiple vendors to get, somewhat fungible objects or items made for them. And so the concern is that on the one hand, on let's say call it on the U.S. side, and obviously it's not just in the U.S., but on the U.S. side, companies are quite happy to get what they can get when they can get it, and may not be quite as vigilant as they normally are in terms of what's going on, and able, frankly, to monitor what's going on in the factories that provide their goods and materials. And then so that's sort of on the demand side. On the supply side, in the factories, there are less people out there conducting factory audits and inspections, and there are less government officials out there looking around. Frankly, a lot of these government officials are susceptible to bribery, as we've written about a great deal already. And so the concern is that you have sort of a perfect storm of desperate folks trying to get things, not so very unscrupulous folks providing those things. And so we are worried that companies in the U.S. and elsewhere that let down their guard during this time are going to pay a hefty price, both in terms of potential criminal exposure as well as reputational exposure when this passes. And then people start looking, once the dust clears, they look at what's going on and they see that companies may not have been entirely on point when it comes to monitoring their supply chains. And so we urge our clients to maintain a vigilant attitude towards compliance. I understand that some of the bigger infrastructure projects may have to sort of take a little bit of a rest right now, but when it comes to sort of due diligence of vendors, when it comes to the basic things that you would expect a company to do, we urge our clients to keep on it, and frankly also help them talk to their, the people they report to impress upon them why this is not the time to slacken the efforts. So that's sort of what we're seeing if you will, on the front lines and across a range of clients and industries, but there is a common theme there.
Marcus, just one quick question before we turn it to Dunstan, which is, as you mentioned, all of the risk is there for there to be heightened, challenges. Given that there aren't people conducting these inspections and clients can't get there, how will we know about the impacts on the ground given this? Are there other methods by which issues can come to light?
I mean, look, we always are monitoring hotlines and things like that. My personal belief and this is true, every legal newspaper writes about it these days, is that in the white collar world, once the dust has settled a little bit, there's going to be an explosion. Whenever the government gives away a lot of money, there tends to be a lot of fraud. There's going to be an explosion of white collar work. And I think the same is true for our compliance side of the house. I think we're going to not really be able to gauge, and very specifically on your question, Anita, we're not going to be able to really gauge the impacts until travel restrictions are lifted, people are able to go back into factories, and people are able to look around. Again, a lot of these factories, many of these factories, at least in the last couple of months, were not even supposed to be open. But again, someone who's willing to essentially conscript labor is also willing to violate local laws and regulations when it comes to factory closures and so forth. So and I'm curious what Dunstan has to say about this and what Peter thinks. My suspicion, and that's all it is, right? We're all operating in the darkness a little bit here. My suspicion is that we're not going to truly be able to gauge the impacts until the pandemic is slackened.
Thanks. And Dunstan, over to you. You actually, BSR has developed a tool, a rapid response tool to help businesses address these kinds of challenges. So if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation. Look forward to the questions. Bear with me a minute, I've just lost my notes. Hitting too many tabs at the same time. I should be used to this by now. Hold on. There we go. So as Anita mentioned at the beginning, there's a critical role for business to play during the time of COVID-19. That's clear for everybody to see. But as Anita also mentioned at the start, I think that raises a very important question. What are the key human rights principles for companies to uphold during this time of public emergency? And a number of you on the call may be familiar with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Anita mentioned that there's a wide variety of people that may be on this call. They essentially set out the expectation that companies should identify and assess actual and potential adverse human rights impacts and take appropriate action to address them. So the spirit of the UNGPs is that you identify and assess actual and potential human rights impacts and take appropriate action to address them. Now, under normal circumstances, companies would have months or even years to complete that due diligence. So that due diligence process is often quite thorough. It can take some time. What we're seeing with our member companies is that in the age of COVID-19, decisions are being made by the hour or by the day or by the week that have very significant implications for human rights and may impact human rights for months and years to come. So we have decisions being made very rapidly that have significant human rights impacts. So what we did was we took the UNGPs and the various human rights principles and standards and methodologies upon which they were built to develop a rapid human rights due diligence tool to help companies with that rapid decision-making challenge. And so what the tool does is guide companies through the key elements of due diligence when they have very little time available. So the idea is, if we've only got a short period of time to make a decision, how do we at least make sure that we're addressing some of the key expectations of the UNGPs? We published this tool about 6 weeks ago. We're aware of at least 4 or 5 companies that have been using it to make real decisions. Unfortunately, I'm not able to share some of those cases because they're quite sort of recent and obviously deal with quite sensitive issues. I should also say it's a generic tool. We created it for any company in any industry making a decision on all sorts of different human rights. So clearly it needs tailoring to specific companies and specific circumstances. I've personally been applying this a little bit in the technology industry. So thinking about questions around privacy and public health, for example, or freedom of expression, misinformation, disinformation, public health, dealing with issues like that. So what I'm going to do briefly, if this works, is share the tool itself on the screen to talk you through it briefly. So we start by asking a series of questions to understand the situation, the challenge, if you like. So what is the decision that's been made? What is the situation? Is the rule of law being applied? Are emergency powers being used in this particular circumstance? But then some very important questions from a human rights point of view. Who are the rights holders in this particular situation? Are they users? Are they customers? Are they employees? Are they workers at a supplier? Of those rights holders, who is most vulnerable? What are the vulnerable populations that could be most significantly impacted by the decision? Then going through the long list of human rights impacts that may exist. So what are the actual or potential adverse human rights impacts that might be faced by the rights holder? And what we typically do is have next to us as we're going through this, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 2 covenants, the ILO fundamental principles on rights at work, other international human rights instruments that may be relevant. And we go through the list of human rights one by one. And what is the severity of these impacts? How many people might they impact? How serious would the impact be for the victim? Could the impact be remediated later? So that sort of sets the scene, but then we get into the actual decision itself. So we ask questions like, or the tool asks questions like, what is the company's policy on this particular topic? A very helpful one, has the company done human rights due diligence on this particular topic in the past? And what did it say? Are there things that you have from previous human rights assessments that can be applied here? And for those who may be in a subsidiary or in a joint venture, is there somebody at company HQ that I should be engaging with to inform a good decision? Then we move on to something that's extremely important in a human rights-based approach, which is actually having meaningful engagement with those people who might be impacted by a decision. So who are the potential stakeholders who I could consult with directly? Is it appropriate to contact them in this case? If so, how? Do I have trusting relationships with various stakeholders? Lots of sort of tips and tricks for companies as to how to do that well in practice. And then finally, what is it that the company should do? So what can the company do to avoid or prevent or mitigate an actual or potential impact? What leverage does the company have to address the impact or influence the wrongful practices of another entity? A lot of the time we're doing human rights due diligence where it's not necessarily the company that's causing the harm. It might be a government making a bad decision or implementing a policy in a bad way. It might be suppliers. So what leverage does the company have to affect change in the wrongful practices of another? And what transparency should we provide? How should we communicate this decision? Are there things we should be communicating alongside this decision? Are there reasons why we shouldn't or couldn't be transparent now? And if so, what alternatives might exist? And then finally, record keeping. What record should we make of this particular decision? So as I mentioned, this is a very generic tool. This is meant to be written for written for any company in any industry. It would need to be tailored for specific companies. And I'll just mention one final thing. I've been using this more with technology companies, and in that sector, the tool points out or links out to something called the Syracuse principles that set out very important guardrails for decisions during times of emergency. And the Syracuse principles were written for governments rather than for companies, but I think set some important direction or inspiration for companies to use. So is the course of action in accordance with the law? Is it being directed towards a legitimate aim? Is the action proportionate to that aim? Is it strictly necessary? Are there other ways of achieving that desired outcome that has a less negative impact on human rights? And then very, very importantly, during times of emergency, is the decision or the action of limited duration? How do we address this risk that we make decisions now in the name of public health that have long-term implications for things like surveillance or human rights impacts that may exist beyond the life of this particular healthcare emergency? So is the decision, is the action of limited duration? So looking forward to the discussion. Happy to answer any questions on this or other engagements we've had with companies seeking to take a human rights-based approach to COVID-19, but I hope this was helpful.
Great. Thanks so much, Dunstan. Yes, and we'll now open it up for questions. We have several already, and all of these resources, the rapid response tool and others, will be posted along with the video on the website. So thank you all, and if there are other resources, please feel free to share. So Peter, I'll begin with you. There are a couple of questions for you. One about social media companies rising to criticism about misinformation or just information management around treatments, right? So you mentioned hydroxychloroquine. So how do you deal with these issues, right? What kind of responsibilities does Novartis take for what kind of information gets out about the medicines and trials? And a second question for you, which is that given the current pandemic, how can you evaluate the capacity of your supply chain? So you do have these principles, but what are you doing to kind of validate what's going on?
Yeah, these are two really good questions. So the misinformation management is a really tricky one in this day and age. Of course, we are a company of scientists, and so we obviously believe in science, and that's what we preach. We try to do it as best as we can. If you go to our website, I was going to drop a couple of links in the chat here. We did put up a big or a blog post at least on our hydroxychloroquine clinical trials. Obviously, there was a ton of misinformation about that particular drug and what was happening with it. We did make several million doses available, as I mentioned, but that's backed up by science, or will be backed up by science. We certainly weren't coming out and saying, "Hey, everybody, go, take one of these pills or do whatever you can to save yourself from COVID-19." Not at all. It's very measured. We have really good communications sort of processes in place around this, because we have to deal with it all the time as we're releasing medicine. We have to manage expectations about what exactly it can and cannot do. Another resource we've since put up, let's see. Yeah, another resource I'll put up is called A Visual Tour of Scientific Strategies for Combating Coronavirus, just talking a little bit more in detail around what the scientific method is to developing a vaccine, what clinical trials are, what the process really looks like. So we've tried to get some stuff out there to do our part in managing misinformation, but it's tough. It's a good question. The second question on capacity building in the supply chain, that's a really important question, because it's one thing to say, hey, we put out a 4-page document, there, we've done our duty, you guys go figure it out. I don't think that's quite enough. I'm with you on that. Unfortunately, and we'll have to do more to figure out exactly how much we can support some of our suppliers. And I will certainly champion a risk-based approach on that. We're in an interesting supply chain or sort of value chain, because most of our suppliers are in factories or other businesses that are heavily regulated because they're in the pharmaceutical industry. So all of this stuff has to be under quality control. It's often audited for a number of different things, often by law, both international and domestic regulation all over the world. And so a lot of these factories are pretty clean, as we would say, but they're also involved high-skilled labor. There's not a lot of vulnerable populations that are working in our first tier factories that are at least off-site for us. Where things start to get a little bit more black box for us is what the second tier and the third tier and fourth tier start to look like. And if we do take a risk-based approach, that's where we need to start looking. We haven't been able to do any evaluation in the last 2 months. We have been doing in-country market human rights impact assessments for the last 3 years. We've done 8 total. We had 4 more planned this year. We've had to postpone all of those trips, obviously, for now. But I just got an email today from a colleague that was flagging us to some conversation about how to do remote audits and remote assessments using things like Google Glass. And so getting those to suppliers and then taking a virtual tour and talking to management remotely from, even if we can't get there in person. I don't think just because we can't go visit a factory in person doesn't mean we can't help them somehow, or help deliver a solution, or help figure out what their capacity to take that on is. It does get really difficult though, because I sort of come back to what can we do? Are we supposed to provide personal protective equipment to hundreds of thousands of supplier employees around the world? Maybe not all of them, but maybe there are some places that we could take a look, and where it's a higher risk, or where there's a known vulnerable group of people that we could kind of come in and say, look, we understand, these are our commitments. We understand you're going to have a difficulty meeting them. Here's how we can help and support. But I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like going forward. And there's a really, really difficult question around how far companies go in kind of providing the resources for their suppliers to do business and human rights, to implement what we want them to do, trying to partner with them and maybe work with them over a longer period of time, put them more on a corrective action plan with different milestones that we'd like to see them meet over the next 3 years. We don't have 3 years on this one, so I'm not sure. It's a great question. I will take that away as kind of a to-do item on my list, is to just go back and say, hey, wait a second, maybe we do need to be a little bit more proactive about getting into the really riskier parts of our supply chain and see what kind of assessment and capacity building we can do.
Well, Peter, just to that question, and I think this is something that I'll ask Marcus and Dunstan to talk about too, is what is that incentive, right? So when there's the pressure to just make sure that supplies keep coming and that factories keep producing, there's also a disincentive to actually at this particular time to look further, right? And to actually go and push and figure out what's going on, right? So I guess the question is, how is Novartis and the human rights team coming up with a principled approach to this? And do you see that as something that other companies can do as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're most concerned about is that we don't want to put excessive amounts of pressure on suppliers so that they then cut corners, as Marcus was talking about, so that they then cut corners and put workers at a heightened risk or actually have some kind of harm come to their workers. So we have a large third-party risk management team. That's where our human rights team sits within Novartis. So there's 7 risk areas that we're looking at, all focused on our external third parties. There's a lot of different points of engagement for that. A lot of it right now is focused on our first tier suppliers, so which is fine from, say, an anti-bribery standpoint or environmental or animal rights welfare position. But when we really start to look at where the human rights at risk is, we are trying to figure out in real time right now how to leapfrog and get down into some of those riskier places.
So Marcus, a question for you. And again, if there are others who have questions, please feel free to just send them via Q&A. So Marcus, a question about, is it enough to wait for the dust to settle in terms of figuring out what these human rights impacts are? Or can you see, or have you seen any companies get creative about monitoring these issues? Peter's mentioned, creating new ways to do remote monitoring from a company place, but have you seen anything on the ground or interesting models? And I'll add a question to you too, which is, how do you counsel companies when it might be more convenient not to look during this time to do so? What are the arguments that you use for why they should still continue to pursue compliance and due diligence?
Maybe I'll take the last question first, Anita. And that is, we, like a lot of compliance folks and white collar folks, essentially speak to their self-interest, right? And in other words, it is true that from an immediate perspective, there might be an incentive to put compliance work on as sort of a secondary issue to be dealt with later, put it on the shelf a little bit for now. And that's why we write, for example, the article in Bloomberg that Kendall and I wrote together. It talks about the risks, the reputational, the legal risks that'll be almost certain to follow if companies do not do what they need to do. On the and something Peter mentioned really fits in with the first question, which is to some extent leverage, right? And where is the risk? And so, although and we all speak at a lot of get-togethers of people involved in human rights work. There's a bit of a disagreement sometimes about where the risk lies geographically as well as in a supply chain. From our perspective, having seen a lot of factories and done a lot of this work, it is really the secondary and the tertiary suppliers further down the supply chain. And then it becomes a question when it comes to your question of sort of how do we essentially know what's going on? How do we audit? How do we do due diligence? A lot of that comes down to leverage. And anyone who works in supply chain, they've experienced it. In other words, if you're, the world's largest retailer, yeah, you have a lot of leverage and you can say, here's what I expect and I want reports and I want or even as Peter said, I could use Google Glass and I want to see virtual tours. The real challenge is for companies. Number one, very few companies have ever really mapped their supply chain. It's surprising how vast supply, right? I think something like the Fortune 200 manufacturer has 9,000 suppliers, and then obviously multiply that by the number of sub-suppliers. Or rather 9,000 suppliers, but again, unknown total number of sub-suppliers. The ability to actually get in there is limited. And so really auditing, doing these unannounced, and unannounced doesn't mean like you show up out of the blue. It's sort of relatively unannounced auditing. I think that's what's going to have to happen to really get a better sense of it. And again, there probably are creative ways to do it now, but while attentions are elsewhere, and frankly, a lot of companies are closed and are operating on very limited resources, only the companies with the strongest leverage that really can say, I want you to do these things now, and their suppliers jump to it. And those numbers are very small, the number of companies that can really exercise that kind of control. So even though it's not a satisfying answer, at least in my experience and what we're seeing, there will have to be just a little bit of time will have to pass until we really get a better sense of what's happening. And frankly, we'll have to read the newspapers about what scandals happen and what companies. Hopefully none of our clients, hopefully not anyone we all work with, but that's going to be the other gauge of what ultimately this pandemic has wrought upon supply chains.
And Dunstan, back to you. So BSR has developed a rapid response tool. Now, it wasn't created necessarily for the pandemic, but you're seeing it being used now. So again, it's that same question. When there's a tension between companies perhaps not looking too hard during this time because they want to keep markets open and supplies flowing, what are the arguments that BSR is using, and what has convinced companies to actually use this tool and then to remediate?
I was saying, good question while I was on mute, but it's still a good question. And I also want to pick up on the misinformation question from earlier on. I think for the people that we are most frequently engaged with in companies, and we're talking about the world's largest brands here, so the companies that do have more leverage, more profile, we're engaging with people that are asking questions about who are we as a company, what are our values, and how do we make sure we stick to them during this difficult time. And so that's a sort of optimistic view of business, if you like, but the reality is that people like that do exist inside companies. So very practically speaking, those inside companies that are pushing for human rights due diligence, for decisions being made today, or wanting companies to speak out in favor of a reformed social contract, for example, there are people inside companies who are advocating for those things as the right thing to do. And to the extent there's a business case, I think the point that Marcus mentioned earlier on around when the dust settles and people look back, there is going to be an accountability moment or a number of moments where people look back and say, did the company stay true to its values during the most important time? And so we've seen, for example, the Business Roundtable statement being quoted back at companies. Are you staying true to this notion that companies have a role beyond returns to the shareholder? Just on the misinformation question to Peter, I think there's an interesting connection here between what's happening on misinformation and the point I mentioned towards the end about decisions having a limited duration during the time of public health emergency. So all the main social media companies have taken a much stricter stand on misinformation, especially as it relates to COVID-19, than they perhaps typically would to misinformation on their platforms. And I think there's an interesting question to be asked around what is learned during this time about misinformation, and how much of that might be continued afterwards, and how much of that might be stopped once we reach the end of the public health emergency. So right now, it's important for social media companies to restrict, well, I said misinformation, but also disinformation, information that's deliberately out there to deceive. I think there's an onus on companies to take a tougher stance than they have done in the past on other pieces of misinformation. But how much of that is continued? How much of that is stopped when the pandemic comes to an end? And who decides when that moment is? I think there are some important questions around actions companies are taking today that will either continue or not once we come through the other side.
Thanks, Dunstan. And we have a question that really is for all three of you. It's a broader question. from a representative of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center who deals with Mexico and Central America. And so there, I think, a larger concern now about wanting to shorten supply chains, not only because of the pandemic, but again, rethinking models of supply chains post-pandemic, thinking about responsible consumption and sustainability. So there's just, I think, a question about, do you think in the long term, after we get through this, that workers and others who are part of fair trade or who are part of kind of the global south are going to be impacted by how we rethink global supply chains? You know, so there may be a benefit to keeping things local, to protectionism of some sort, but what is that going to mean to our larger development agenda? Peter, I don't know if you begin with you, any thoughts there?
That's a really, really good question. And I guess I would say maybe three things. One is it's very, very difficult for large multinational corporations who have extensive operations around the world to very quickly, and especially in a time like we're living in right now, pick up and bring everything home. So I would just be very wary of PR stunts that a lot of companies might be trying to do right now, and sort of gain some quick wins with the public by saying we're going to bring all of our factories home. We saw this 4 years ago, right after Trump was elected. And if you go back and look at some of these case studies, a lot of those promises never actually played out. The fact it was sort of a big announcement, hey, we're going to take a look at bringing a factory back to the US, never actually happened. I would be really surprised if global multinational corporations just pull the plug on globalization and start to bring everything back home. But they're fully entitled to, I guess, if there is a business reason for it. At the end of the day, these are businesses, and they will make a business justification or a business rationale for what they do. So it very well could be a risk if the company perceives that the risk of having a supply chain or a very extended supply chain, overseas is a higher risk in a world where we might have to think about this a little bit more often. The final thing I'll say to counter that is to say, we now have an expectation that companies also must respect human rights, full stop. And so wherever they do business, they have to conduct good due diligence, but also put into place good processes and practices that respect human rights, whether that's in the US or the global north or other countries that they're currently operating in. That's not going to change. But neither is business. And if companies bring operations back home, then they'll do so on business justification grounds.
Okay. Marcus or Dunstan, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure, I'll give it a shot, because I mean, really, this also starts getting into more socio-political, moral questions of where our economies, global economies, go and the impacts, right? Because we've seen a lot of operations overseas that are run very badly, but when they go away, the people are bad off because they still want to work there. I do think, I mean, it becomes a question of size, like Peter said, of size of the supply chain, expansiveness, the size of the company, and also margins, right? I mean, if you're making a high margin product that you could make in America, but you're making overseas, you may be more tempted to bring it back. I mean, I can see a lot of good reasons, frankly, for companies trying to shorten their supply chains because of the uncertainty, because we see what that's doing to companies right now. On the other hand, as Peter said, a business reality is that a lot of our clients, a lot of companies in the US and overseas just can't do it. I mean, they just literally cannot get the manufacturing in the US. And I can think of very specific examples that I have in my mind where I've had conversations with clients that say, look, we've tried. We've tried to have X product made over here, and it just didn't work in terms of both the quality and the time and the number of people and meeting our demands. And so, for better or for worse, a global supply chain is going to be in everyone's future. But I think this has opened up a lot of people's eyes, and I think there will be a lot of companies, the ones that can afford it, are going to want to have a little more control over their own futures and not have this happen again. And I think it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. Obviously, becomes sort of a political conversation as well. But I think from a very practical business perspective, that's where the decisions are going to be made more than from a political perspective.
Great, thanks. Dunstan, any last reflection on that question?
Just one thing. I mean, as an internationalist who believes in global values, this is the thing I fear the most, is a retreat into more localism. I remember after the 26th election, we used to say we want companies to stand up for science and stand up for global values. And standing up for science, that's very easily said today, right? It's obvious to all of us that science is something to take strong notice of. But global values is the thing I fear, that the sense that there are universal values that apply to all of us, and that we should be thinking in global terms, and we should be thinking about how the operations of business has global impacts and local impacts, depending on the company, everywhere in the world. I fear we may move away from that, and that all of us who believe in global values should be speaking up in favor of maintaining that priority.
So there's two last questions, so I'm just going to read those out and ask you each to conclude this rich discussion. One was just, Peter, to you about whether or not Novartis is thinking about producing test kits at all. Is that something that's part of your business model? And then a broader, again, one of these larger questions around the fact that, and if we look at Latin America, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, that in some jurisdictions, multinationals are being declared essential services, while of course you see people who are in the informal economy or in smaller businesses, right, being told they have to stop working, right? So that creates a big divide. And I think there's just a larger question about, when we talk about companies thinking about respect for human rights, are they also thinking about the optics of how they operate in these environments where some businesses are operating and others are shut down? So with that, we'll go back to you. So Peter, to you.
Yeah, real quick on the test kits. I'm not aware that we are developing those, but you know, whatever's publicly available on our website, Novartis.com, is going to be the best information that you'll get on that. Yeah, this is another really good question about how big multinational companies should act when they are, you know, listed as essential services or sort of given preferential treatment in developing countries. It's a complicated question and often one that is out of our control. I think there is some obligation to take a look where there is a problem, but in many cases, this is governments or maybe corrupt local leaders who might be, you know, preferencing big companies because they think that that might bring more jobs or long-term economic benefit. We do take a very close look at bribery and corruption, but you know, there's a lot of different ways to work around that. There's a lot of suppliers that we work with that we don't have as much control over and we don't have as much insight into. So that's always a problem and will be a risk, I'm sure, for a long, long time. One area that I think from a business and human rights standpoint, from the whole field development, that companies haven't really been able to get into yet is the area of lobbying, both in host countries and home countries, and trying to bring a human rights approach to lobbying activities. Just in some guidance, I think in the IHRB guidance that's now posted up here, there is one of the bullet points is, you know, take a look and make sure that in whatever countries you're operating in, you are doing some local lobbying to make sure they're protecting workers, protecting local businesses, and use your leverage in that way. So again, it's not okay for us to just stand back and say, well, we're not the government, not our problem. No, we are a presence in a lot of these countries. And as Marcus has reiterated, if we do have the leverage to go in there and do some lobbying, we can. For the pharma industry, this is an area that we have a lot of work to do. I'll just leave it at that. We have a ton of work to do.
Peter, I'm just going to jump in. We just got one last question saying that there was an article in NPR today about factories in Syria ramping up production of hydroxychloroquine. So I guess there's a question here. Are there studies underway that contradict the statement about there being lack of evidence that it can cure the disease? So just an interesting.
Boy, that's great. Thanks for flagging that. I hadn't seen that, but yeah, I'll definitely go take a look and we'll see. Yeah, it's not our factory, but we'll take a look.
Marcus.
We don't have any factories in Syria. I'll put it that
Marcus?
Yeah, I think, and this gets back again to a little bit of leverage, but also mapping your supply chain. I mean, look, the companies that we have, and it's going to sound partisan, but I am proud of the companies we represent. They are very concerned about the optics of where they operate locally. But I'd say the vast majority of in the supply chain of companies, maybe let's say manufacturing, our clients don't know where they are, who they are, because like I used to run a little company made like ski wear and t-shirts and things like that. I had no idea who was making my stuff. You know, I didn't know who was what the working conditions were. So I think the companies, the large companies that operate overseas, that operate in some of these higher risk jurisdictions, are very aware of how it looks if they're getting preferential treatment, or for that matter, if there's a story in the newspaper about bribery, which is, the other area in which I focus. But, for a lot of large retailers, manufacturers, their supply chains are so vast, they have no control over, no insight into, and have never visited and never will visit the factories in which their products are being made, along with the fact that along with probably the products of their competitors. They're all being made in some cases, in some industries, actually a surprisingly small number of factories. So it just depends on the industry, it depends on the size of the company.
Thanks. And Dunstan?
Yeah, just to pick up on that point, and also some themes that have come up during this discussion, I think this is where a human rights-based approach is very helpful for improved decision-making. And let me say a bit more about what I mean by that. That when we've started to engage with, let's call them Western brands, so US, European companies, on how they should respond the right way to whatever COVID-based decision that they're making, it's very easy to have that narrative, that discussion focused on what's being said in the United States, what's being said in Western Europe, or a small number of other locations. And that's the dialogue that's often had. So how should we deal with misinformation or privacy or manufacturing supply chains? A lot of the dialogue is shaped by what we feel in the United States and Western Europe. A human rights-based approach forces you to think through what is the perspective of vulnerable groups? Who are the stakeholders who have a stake in this decision, and what are their perspectives? And we've had some success sort of broadening the discussion out to make sure those factors become an important part of a decision. And that's more easily done in a brand that itself has users or consumers globally, as distinct from having manufacturing in one part of the world and selling in another. So a lot of the companies that I work with are actually global brands that have a presence in most countries around the world. So it's been easier for that global case to be made than I think perhaps those that have a predominantly Western brand, Western markets, and are sourcing overseas for that.
Great. Well, thank you all for your perspective, and thank you for listening and watching, those of you who are with us. This will be recorded and posted online. We will be hearing in the next couple of weeks from people who are on the other side, right, which is from those who are other human rights defenders or people working with workers on the ground in factories in places in Southeast Asia and others. So I hope you'll come back and listen and hear about what they're experiencing. And similarly, we'll be also talking to people representing unions and workers who are on the front line in places like the United States, again, to see, how are their human rights being respected in a domestic market as well. So thank you all, Marcus, Dunstan, Peter, for sharing your perspectives on trying to get companies to see the benefits of respecting human rights during a very challenging time. We really appreciate your insight, and let's see, how the next few months play out. So thanks again to everyone, and this will conclude our session.
Thank you, Anita.
Thanks, Anita.
Thank you.